Hey there, thanks for tuning into Duckbricks. I'm Chris and welcome to a brand new episode of Bionicle Fanon Reviews, the show where I review some of the canon and non-canon Bionicle models that I find particularly interesting, or in this case, have won a Duckbricks Fanon contest. So a couple of months ago, I hosted the Bionicle Fanon contest for the Dinosaurs of Bota Magna. This was the second contest we ever did, and we got so many entries in, particularly so many large category entries, that I couldn't just review one of the winners. Oh no, because today we will be reviewing one of the many different finalists of the Dinosaurs of Bota Magna Fanon contest. If you look over there, this is a life-sized version of the model that we are reviewing today. I am incredibly excited to showcase this to all of you because it has been a lot of months in the making. Many brickling orders were involved in terms of getting that fully built. I have a massive box of dinosaur parts that I have been building off of, and there are so many dinos we have yet to cover. And so, let's, without further ado, jump right into this particular build. Alright, so right here we have the Apohka by Jopi Tropi. This was the 10th place winner of the Bionicle Dinosaurs Fanon contest, and man is this a really exciting model. It is our first Brachiosaurus or four-legged large creature type model, and as you can see, it barely fits in my review studio. I really have to kind of push it all the way to the edge to even make it fit within frame, so you can just see how large this is compared to my hand. This is a huge model. So very impressive. Now, I do want to get a couple things out of the way because this is not actually 100% accurate to the source material. You see, this was a digital entry, and it actually requires you to place a bar into the receiving hole of certain pins that cannot physically work. You physically cannot place bars into the receiving holes of 2-length long pins that have axle receivers at the end. The same goes for the things at the top here. The head itself was supposed to have a lot more detail. Actually, you can't even see where I'm pointing. There we go. The head itself was supposed to have a lot more detail, although unfortunately you can't actually attach them in the way that it's set up on the studio model. I believe that that's just kind of an issue where maybe the builder didn't realize that connection is not physically possible, but yeah, there's supposed to be a flex tube running down this way right here. Not a very big visual change. I guess it might help with some stability, but that was just literally impossible. Like, you cannot connect them onto here. So unfortunately, that is not accurate here. Everything else, though, is pretty accurate and does fall into the reasonable realms of legal building techniques. For the most part, there are some very strange connections where I just wasn't sure. Maybe I was just not doing it right, but things are not actually attached here. We'll get into that when we get into building techniques, but for the most part, visually speaking, this is a really good looking model, and it is pretty sturdy. Despite my complaints of some wacky connections and some really strange ways things are attached, this does hold together and it is pretty hard to break apart. Sure, the neck does tend to wobble back and forth a little bit because it only is mounted on a single ball joint, but for the most part, everything does come together really nicely for this entire model. Now, we're going to have to break this one up a bit because this is a very large model, and I think it makes sense to cover it by sections because, again, that's what I can only fit on my camera in my review studio. So starting off, we are going to take a look at the posability. So we'll start off with the legs and work our way up. So here we can see a closer look at the legs of the model itself. It is very simple, actually, in the way it's constructed. It basically is just using friction joints at every possible opportunity to be able to move the legs back and forth like so. So you can see you get a fair range of motion here, but nothing super crazy. Thankfully, everything is double ball jointed, and again, it is four-legged, so there really are no issues with this potentially coming off. The only complaints is that sometimes the armor pieces are clearly only mounted by a single pin, so they tend to wobble back and forth. This obviously is not an issue when you're building a module digitally, because pieces will just stay in place on the computer, but when you're building it physically, I mean, you can kind of see it's just kind of wobbles here, so that's not a fantastic connection. Would have appreciated this being attached by a little bit more connection points, but it's not a big deal because for the most part it does just tend to fall into place. Now, the feet themselves are really nicely constructed. They cost quite a lot though because they use axles in brown. I did not realize that that was the only usage. I easily would have just used the black ones, but they do use these rare brown axles, and quite a lot of them, may I add. Now, speaking of the price of this model, and we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about the piece usages, but they use a ton of these dark tan pieces which were exclusive to Bionicle G2, which is Very rare nowadays. Obviously, so many of these tan armor panels, which only came in one of the vehicle sets from 2009, so this is not a very cheap model, but then again, it looks really good when physically built. I'm a big fan of the way this looks, and yeah, overall, you can see that is how the posability works. Now, you can armor the guns or angle the guns different ways up and down. I can kind of imagine these as kind of like in Horizon or whatnot, kind of basically guns or shooters mounted on the sides of these dinosaurs that you can knock off or maybe try to use for yourselves. It's got, of course, fitting in with the theme, Thornax launchers here for the Bionicle 2009 theming. You have a really good semblance of being fully armored up here, and overall, that is a pretty good amount of posability for the legs themselves. You can bend these back and forth like so. Now, the joint here is interesting because it actually is just mounted on a single friction joint, but then again, it's only 4 legs, so it doesn't really need to be mounted too firmly. And yeah, you can really just see how this is a very cool feat of engineering to get this all to be stable and working together. Moving on upwards to the tail bits, you can see that the tail does have a massive, very expensive, may I add, this was exclusive to the very first Pod Racer sets, but you can see the tail can sort of be angled up and down and back and forth, but not a ton because it tends to start to bend the flex tube here, which really is just held on like so. So you basically have to keep the tail oriented in one particular way, which is not that big of an issue because, again, it does work quite well with the flex tubes to just stay in place. These hoses also make it stay in place, so you're not going to be moving the tail around too much, except for maybe some swishing motion back and forth. But honestly, I kind of like that. I don't really mind the fact that you can't move the tail because I feel like if you didn't have the flex tubes, it would be a lot less actually fixed. It might droop a little bit. This flex tube and these hoses on the bottom are actually making sure that it is staying upright, so that is quite good to me. I don't mind not being able to move the tail too much. Now, moving this around, I'm going to have to literally pick it up and put it down. The head posability is interesting because if you look at the inside there, the entire head is really nicely armored up, but then everything here is just mounted on a single joint. I'm trying to get a good camera angle to showcase this here, but essentially you have one single, not even a friction joint, but one single Bionicle brown hand element, that's this guy right here, is attached to this gray Technic beam, and that just kind of wobbles back and forth a ton, a little bit too much for my taste, and there is probably definitely a better way to attach it, but overall, ignoring that part, the rest of the neck is actually pretty stable thanks to the flex tube that is attaching it all together. It droops a little bit, but if you're careful with it and very, very kind of firm in the way that you move your hands and just make sure not to knock anything over, then it's totally fine, and the neck will be able to be situated just okay. And it really does have an impressive height. That is pretty cool how tall this goes. Of course, the head can move back and forth, and the head is a little bit interesting to me. I think we've summed up posability, so we can go into the building techniques. I'm not quite sure how to parse the head. I guess these stud shooters are supposed to be robotic eyes, but I do like the way that they use the Metru foot piece in conjunction with the silver Pohatu foot extension to look like kind of the mouth of this creature, which I think works out pretty well. Would have been cooler to have actual eyes there, but then again, can't actually attach them because you can't put axles into these particular pins. Or, sorry, you can't put bars into those pins. Moving onwards for the rest of the building techniques, I want to talk a little bit about the torso, because here's where things get interesting. You see all these tubes here? These are not for aesthetics. These are structural. The only way that a lot of these pieces are held on are just by tubes. And that is actually how the entire body comes together, where if you look at the inside here, let's try to get the inside here. This is already coming off. That's a little dangerous, but the only thing keeping this attached completely are tubes. This tube here, let me see if we can get an angle here. This one tube comprises the entire structural system of the model. If this tube falls off, the entire bottom will just fall down. So I don't know how I feel about that. I was initially very, very skeptical, and I was like, what is this doing? But then I built it, and that tube is actually holding on really well. Like, this tube, unless you really mess with it, this is not falling off. So you basically just have it arcing over a beam that holds the entirety of this bottom armor section onto the piece here. And while it's certainly kind of a jank solution to be able to do that, and definitely one that I'm guessing is an after effect of building this model digitally, you don't really have the freedom that you have when you're building it physically and realizing that some things are kind of tend to fall apart and whatnot, but surprisingly, I was very, very shocked, but this does stay together okay with the bottom pieces being held on by just one single flex tube. And I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's interesting. I think what I would call it is interesting. How, as you can see, the top part here, these literally just, I mean, this is pretty free-flowing on the bottom armor here. These all just attach by tubes. This whole piece attaches by tubes and everything. So tubes are the only thing holding this body together. Now, I would not recommend taking it like this and kind of moving it around, because that is a recipe for disaster. This whole thing is just going to fall off because the tube is going to detach, and that tube is very hard to reattach when it detaches. But for the most part, it's alright. I mean, it does hold itself together okay, which is a surprise, but it's nice. And one benefit to this is because everything is basically held on by tubes, you get a very unique look and feel for the armor that feels like it is very organic and layering different armor shells on top of each other, which definitely is not something that could have been easily accomplished if you were just using a standard Technic structure and not just attaching everything by tubes. That is one big benefit here because, again, you have this very organic looking build where even if the building techniques are questionable, the aesthetics are wonderful. And that brings us to aesthetics. Now, having an all-tan dinosaur is a great idea, and I think aesthetically speaking, this is probably one of the best looking dinosaurs out of the entire lot. We didn't get many sets for Bionicle that were predominantly tan, so this is a really special one to kind of stand out amongst some other stuff. I guess the Vorox were the closest we got in the Magna line, but really this takes it to another level, and I really appreciate the amount of detail that was factored into crafting the look and feel of this model aesthetically speaking, because you've got spikes. Everything spiky is in silver, so you've got Thornax launchers here. You have the spikes kind of going alongside the top of the neck here. You have the back spikes, you have the tail spikes, but then everything else is just tan and brown. This is very, very consistent in its color scheme, and aesthetically speaking, the way that the armors all come together is really impressive. This is such an impressive way that the torso looks, even if the construction is, well, highly questionable. If you look in here, it's just a mess of tubes that's holding this all together, and the most simple Technic frame, just a square Technic frame on the inside with some standard kind of torso elements attached to keep some of these armor pieces attached and whatnot. It looks really good. I actually do like the way that when you look inside, there's so many hoses which are actually structural. They're not just for show, which I initially thought, because it really does add an extra dimension to this model where, sure, maybe to an extent it feels a little bit hollow on the inside, but for the most part it feels very solid and armored up here, which is something I really do appreciate about this creature. And so, with that, I think we have summed up our look at this creature in terms of posability, building techniques, and aesthetics, and it's now time to bring over some representative samples from the Bionicle world and compare this against some Glatorian and Agori. To do that, we've brought alongside Akhar, the Glatorian, who doesn't even come up to the top of the torso there. That is very cool. And we have Ranu, one of the Agori, who really just only goes up to his legs if you kind of use it as a scale comparison. So that is really cool to me. This definitely feels much more in scale with the Bionicle characters in terms of being a large style of Brachiosaurus-like character. The Apohka is definitely a really interesting creature because we haven't really seen anything like it from the Bionicle world, and even though it still manages to stay within mostly the Bionicle aesthetic, utilizing these armor pieces, there's a lot of CCBS, which is not bad because it is a somewhat organic creature. We do want it to make sense in the organic sense, but maybe there's just a little bit too much CCBS used where it kind of feels like it overpowers the G1 aesthetic. That's not a huge deal though. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention is you have the life counters here. That is really funny how they actually included 2 life counters from the Glatorian series onto the dinosaur itself. I think that's wonderful that they actually factored that in there. That definitely gives it some points on the believability in universe because it makes sense that it had the life counters that the Glatorian have as well. So that is really cool how they actually factored that in. I do appreciate that quite a lot. And one thing I've been doing with all these dinosaurs is trying to make them be rideable. So can they be rideable by a Glatorian character? Let's see. So I think the placement, maybe we'll put him here. I don't want to mess around too much with the torso because I don't want those hoses to detach, but I mean, that kind of works. That looks pretty good, actually. Now that I look at it, that's a pretty good look to have a Glatorian be riding him. Now, maybe it can be ridden by 2 people, like an Agori here as well. Ah, yeah, look at that. It's almost like the hollowness are meant to be feet holds for the Agori. That's cool. Okay, I like that. That's quite nice. So now you can see you actually have it being rideable by an Agori and Glatorian, which is very cool. The scaling works out pretty well, and so I think it's time to sum up my final points on the model. So in terms of believability in universe, I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10. I think that it definitely relies a lot on CCBS, which is not a bad thing. I love CCBS, I'm probably its biggest fan, but fitting it into the Bionicle G1 system does tend to cause some style clashes where these are very smooth and tan, and these are very armored up and detailed. I think what could have been really cool is if the builder tended to maybe make all of the CCBS parts one color and make them seem like organic aspects, and make all of the technological pieces a different color that are more armored up. But then again, I wouldn't have wanted to mess with the color scheme being the tan here, so I don't know, it just feels maybe a little bit of a departure from the Bionicle world. That being said, it still looks really good, especially when being ridden by two different members of the Glatorian and Agori species, and this is overall a very nice looking dinosaur. Moving onwards to the posability. Posability, I'm going to give an 8 out of 10 as well. The legs are good. I think it's nice that you can move them around, whatnot. The head, it's just annoying how this tends to kind of wobble back and forth to pretty severe angles. It's never really any risk of falling off, which is why I'm going to give a con here for posability and not building techniques, because it's actually fairly stable. It just keeps wobbling back and forth, and I'm not a big fan of how that works. That being said, the rest of it is pretty sturdy in the way it's posed. You can, of course, move the head back and forth like so it's not too bad. It's just kind of a mixed bag in terms of posability. Moving onwards to the next point, which is building techniques. This is probably the hardest point that I had to figure out here, and this was one that I really struggled with, because obviously building techniques, they shouldn't work. In theory, they shouldn't work. This should not hold together as well as it does with just hoses. But it does, and it's somehow kind of stable. I mean, I knocked it over a few times with the bottom armor piece just falling off, and that was a real pain to reattach. But it didn't happen at once during my review where I was messing with it a lot, so I mean, it's a lot more stable than I initially imagined when I was putting it together. I was very worried when I was putting it together because I was thinking like, oh man, this is gonna fall apart and it's gonna be really hard to review, but no, it's actually not too bad. Sure, you've got some awkward stuff like these armor pieces being very, very loose and whatnot, but that is kind of one of the pitfalls to building just digitally because you can't really be able to tell and test how loose things are. So, being said, this being built digitally and being as well put together as it is now and actually staying together is a massive pro. And that's why I'm going to give the building techniques a 7.5 out of 10. Maybe it should be a little bit lower because this is just connected with hoses, but it works, so I'm giving it a 7.5 out of 10, and that is the final verdict. And lastly, for aesthetics, easy 9.5 out of 10. What a cool color scheme. I love the attention to detail with the silver pieces being only mechanical and spiky. You've got a great mix between the tan and brown. That looks wonderful to me. Love the way it all came together. And overall, it is a very unique color scheme and look for a Bionicle creature, but one that definitely feels like it is its own creature. A very, very unique way that it's all set up, and despite it being very, very expensive to buy, I believe, well, how many of these? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like, oh, okay, over like 20. I think over 20. I don't even want to count the rest of them. Over 20 of these exclusive tan pieces that only came in one of the larger 2009 vehicles. It's worth it. It's worth it just putting it all together, seeing those tan shells all around it. That is just a very cool look to me, and I'm very, very happy with the way this turned out. And so with that, we have summed up our review of the Apohka. Let me know in the comments below what you think of it. If you're planning on building it physically yourselves, you can find the studio model in my Discord linked below. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this review, and be sure to stay tuned for even more LEGO news, reviews, discussion, and analyses coming your way very soon. Bye for now.